Here's a question. If the government could coordinate its spending and taxation in time, that is, for example, spend the same amount of money on a single day as it taxes on that day, as the taxes that have to be paid by people on that day, if it could coordinate spending and taxation like this, are the taxes funding paying for the spending, or is the spending paying for the taxes? Here's the government, and let's imagine they're hiring 3 workers, 3 people who are working for the government doing some sort of office work. And these people are paid with the currency that's the legal currency in this country. These coins here, each could be $100, they could be $1. I've just removed any reference to a numerical unit to make it easy. The point being, whatever the unit is, one of these here is equal to one of these here. And these here are the taxes that have to be paid to the government. So the government's spending the same amount as it takes in taxes. And let's say it does this on the same day, the 19th of every month. On the 19th, it spends this money in the wages of its employees, and it's the same day every month where that same amount has to be paid to the government in taxes. So which comes first? Is the government able to spend this money because it got it in taxes? Or is the population able to pay these taxes because they got this money from the government? I've been saying population here. It's the population that have to pay the taxes, the rest of the population, and as well as the employees of the government. The main point being that this means that the people who are directly receiving the money from the government, the employees, are not necessarily the ones that have to pay that same amount in taxes. For example, the tax burden on the public employees could be this 1 unit of tax here, and on the rest of the population, it could be these 2 units, the other 2 units of tax that are due. But the rest of the population, because they don't sell goods directly to the government, that could be the case, they could do that, but let's just say they don't for simplicity, and their tax burden is these 2 units, and the public employees only need 1 of the coins, 1 of the units of currency to pay their taxes, then they can use those other 2 to trade with the population for goods and services, because the other population needs those 2 units of currency to pay their taxes. So the distribution of the tax burden, what has to be paid to the government, doesn't have to be the same as what the government spending is, what the government gives to the population. The important point is the coordination in time. And so however the money finds its way to the people who need it to pay their tax, it must be that the spending finances the tax payments. The spending happens first, because if the government doesn't spend this money, the population doesn't have the money to pay their taxes. And the demand for the government's money on the 19th of every month, the demand for it because people need it to pay their taxes, to not be thrown in jail, is the very thing that allows the government to spend that money. It's the very thing that makes people willing to work for the government in exchange for that money, or to sell goods in exchange for that money, because they need it. Taxes don't finance government spending. They create a demand for government money, because that government money is how the population is going to finance their tax payments. To make the point a bit more forcefully, let's imagine a firewall between the spending side of government and the taxing side of government. And so each time the taxes were paid and the government got this money, it just piled up. The tax payments piled up in the treasury. Instead of using them, the spending side of government just kept creating new money. Would this system continue to work? Would the population continue to work for the government to produce goods and services in exchange for the government's currency? Or would they stop just because it wasn't the same money that they'd paid in taxes before? Well, the situation hasn't changed. If on the 19th of every month the people have to pay these taxes or they go to jail, the demand for the currency is going to be there. And if the only way to get currency continues to be either directly to work for the government or to trade goods and services with the people who do work for the government, then the demand for this newly created money is going to be exactly the same. To make the point even more forcefully, just imagine the government burned all the money that it received in taxes. Again, the situation wouldn't change because it's not about the money itself. It's not about any value this money has. It's about the fact that the state is putting the population into debt. The population has to pay its debt, its taxes, to the state. And the only way they can pay that debt is with the state's money. And the only way they can get the state's money is by accepting that money as a means of payment for their labor or their goods. But if this is true, then why does the government have to borrow money? Why does it have to issue bonds to get the money it needs to finance its deficits? Well, saying deficit means something's changed. Before, on the same day, the government was spending the exact same amount of money as it demanded in tax. But let's imagine this wasn't the case anymore, because a deficit is always a function of time. You could always get back in taxes at some point in the future the excess that you spent today. The government could pay the wages of its employees on the 18th and have that amount charged in taxes on the 19th. On the 18th, it would be in deficit. On the 19th, no more. So functionally, it's borrowed that money overnight. And so when we understand that a deficit is only really definable as a mismatch in spending and income at some point or in some period of time, it becomes clear what bonds, what government debt is really for. With this graph here, you could see the case where the red line spending could be at some periods of the year much higher than the taxes being paid. And at another point of the year, for example, if there were certain days before which the population had to make sure they'd met all their tax obligations, you might see a peak, a big rise in the tax payments. If the government issues bonds in return for money, the population has money and it gives the money to the government issues the bonds, which is a promise to pay that back with interest in the future. You have the same situation as with the taxes. In the end, where does this money come from? The population has this money because they've been paid by the state, but they don't have a tax obligation falling on them at that particular point in time. The bonds can't possibly be what's financing the government spending, because for the population to have the money to lend to the government to buy the bonds with, the government has to have spent the money first for the population to have. When the government issues bonds, when it apparently borrows money, it's not putting itself into debt any more than it was before. Before we ask what the purpose of bonds is then, let's look at the debt situation. Here are the balance sheets of the population, of the private sector, and the state. Their liabilities, what they owe to other people. Since we're breaking society into two sectors, this is what the population owes to the state, what the private sector owes to the state, and the private sector's assets is what the state owes to it. And it's a mirror image for the state. The state's assets are what the population owe to it, and its liabilities are what it owes to the populations. The population owes this tax to the state, and so they demand money, because when they have that money, they can pay the tax obligations. They're back to net zero wealth. The state has an asset, the taxes that the population is going to pay to it. So at first you could put it like this: because of its monopoly on violence, the state has put itself into a position of net wealth, and the population, because of the tax it has to pay, into a position of net indebtedness. And so the state can issue this money, a liability of it, because giving this to the population is going to allow them to cancel, to annul the state's asset against them. And so the state is also in a balanced position in regards to its wealth. It owes the same amount that it is owed. So what happens when the state can no longer coordinate, because it's very impractical to do so, its expenditure with the taxation? Maybe it spends a lot on this day at the beginning of the year and taxes a lot on another day at the end of the year. So there's money hanging around that could do other things other than paying taxes. Well, let's say the state issues bonds. It appears it's borrowing money to fund its deficit, but its deficit would be the exact amount of money that it's given out that isn't yet needed to pay taxes with. And so if it issued bonds to buy that amount of idle money, it would have the same look as if it was borrowing that money. But what happens? The state sells its bonds to the population, And these are an asset of the population. They mean the government's going to pay them money in the future when these bonds mature. But to buy these bonds, they have to pay with the other asset they have. And so the only incentive to do this is the interest they will earn on these bonds. Most of the money they'll be paid back when they mature was the same amount of money they had before. And so there's an incentive. If the money is just going to be lying around idle until you need to pay it in tax later in the year, you may as well lend it until then so you can earn some interest on it. But has the government increased its indebtedness by doing this? No. It's created new liabilities. These debts, these bonds that it has to pay back. But in doing so, it's destroyed that amount in other liabilities. It's swapped these liabilities, the currency, for these ones, the interest-bearing bonds. It now, when it gets the money back, it's a liability against itself. It's no longer a negative on its balance sheet. And so after this bond issuing operation, you can see the net wealth of the government is precisely the same as it was before. It's not more in debt. And the net wealth of the population is the same as before. The only difference is the interest. And so you could say the population has a bit of net assets in the future, and the government will have a bit of net liabilities, money it has to give out beyond what it got for these bonds in the future. But that money, that little bit of interest, is not the amount that it got for selling the bonds that apparently was financing its spending. But it can't possibly be financing its spending because, again, to buy the bonds, the population first has to get the money from the state spending. So why? Why go to all this effort to issue bonds to get the money back that it just spent? Why not just let the money pile up idly with the population until the day when they have to use it to pay their tax? As long as the total amounts, for example, within a year, are the same or roughly the same, so that all the money that is spent will be needed to pay tax. Just there's a bit of a chaos in terms of the timing. Why worry about issuing bonds? Well, because issuing bonds, like I've said, has nothing to do with financing the government's expenditure. The purpose of it is for monetary policy, to manage the interest rate. There's various interest rates in the economy. There's various markets for lending money for different lengths of time, for issuing debt with different maturities. Debt, overnight debt that you have to pay back tomorrow, which is going to earn a different interest for the lender to one that you only have to pay back in 10 years. And if you imagine all these markets having a supply of funds, of people with savings, with idle money that they want to lend and earn an interest on, and a demand for those funds, then changing the supply is going to affect the interest rate. And so by swapping its liabilities, issuing bonds to increase the number of longer-term debt securities and decrease the currency that's available for overnight short-term lending, the state can affect the interest rates being offered in various money or debt markets. The short-term overnight interest rate is the most important one. It's the one that the central bank, the state, tries to target, to manipulate, to hit its interest rate target. And if you look at this graph again, this red line, this spending, over this blue line, taxation, you can imagine all this is the excess money that the government is pumping into the economy, giving to the population that they don't have to give back to it, at least yet, to pay taxes. So this deficit is making the net wealth of the population, at least if we only consider the period before they have to pay that in taxes, larger. And that means all this money piling up is pushing down the short-term interest rate. And so this is why states issue bonds. They want to change the composition of their own debt. They want to replace the currency, the very liquid debt, which the population holds against them, or part of it, with longer-term debt. Not for their own sake, not for anything to do with their ability to pay, having to manage all the different maturities to make sure they have free cash on hand to meet all their payments. No, because they can create the money. They want to have a certain effect on the private economy, on the lending and borrowing occurring in the private economy, on the economic activity of the private sector through affecting the interest rate. And they do this with monetary policy. So, if the state could perfectly coordinate its spending and its taxation in time, they wouldn't need any bonds because the money they give out couldn't affect the interest rate because it would be immediately taken back in. And that being the case, it's clear that states need neither taxes nor to borrow money to finance their own spending.